Welcome to the Writer's Block podcast. I'm writer Polly Roberts, and every episode I will be in conversation with another Cornwall-based writer, discussing process, why we write, and the part Cornwall plays in our work. I hope you find some wisdom and inspiration in what you hear. The Writer's Block is a creative writing centre for Cornwall. With innovation and creativity at our heart, we offer both a place to write and a unique approach to developing confidence and skills in writing for everyone. Pascale Petit is a French and Welsh poet now living in Cornwall. She has had 4 poetry collections shortlisted for the TS Eliot Prize, and her latest collection, Tiger Girl, was shortlisted for the Forward Prize and Wales Book of the Year. Her last collection, Mama Amazonica, won the inaugural Laurel Prize and the Society of Literature's Ondaatje Prize. Her work explores themes of identity and personal stories among rich natural imagery, and she is described as very much a poet of the environment. I hope you enjoy what you hear. Hi Pascale, and welcome to our podcast. We're really happy to have you along. It feels like a real privilege to have you joining us from the Writer's Block, because we've all heard so much about you, and in fact I've seen you read a couple times, and I did a workshop with you actually when I was doing my master's, but you live up Bodmin Way and we're down Redruth Way. So actually coinciding hasn't really happened for us yet as an organisation and a writer. So it's lovely to have you along.
Thank you for inviting me, Polly.
And you were just saying to me that you moved down to Cornwall 7 years ago, is that right?
Yes. I used to live in East London, in Walthamstow, and so I was near the marshes there. So there was a touch of wilderness there, because that's my inspiration usually.
I can really relate to that. Yeah, I used to live Stamford Hill, and I would get on my bike almost every single day and cycle out to the marshes because I just needed a little injection of nature. So I'm kind of in awe that you managed to last decades like that, if inspiration comes from nature for you.
Yes, well, I've always written from travels, and but I have written about Paris, which was the city of my birth.
Right.
But only by mingling Paris with the Amazon rainforest or something like that.
Amazing. Where did the environments come to you then? Because I'm so curious. Each of your collections is very rich in often like a particular environment. And so how is it that you find which environment you're going to be writing through?
I don't know. I can only talk about a particular instance, I think. So if I talk about how I started Mama Amazonica, my 7th collection, I wrote a poem imagining my mother as the giant Victoria Amazonica lily. And I just knew when I did that I could write more, that there was the whole new mother to make in the Amazon rainforest. So that's how it happened, really. So then eventually I'd been to the Amazon twice already, but quite a long time ago I'd been to the Venezuelan Amazon, to the Lost World, which is more cloud forests than lowland primary forest. And so then eventually, as I was writing Mama Amazonica, I went to the Peruvian Amazon twice and kind of spent time in a very pristine national park, Tambopata National Park. And so the poem, that title poem, which was Mama Amazonica, led to all the rest and led to the travels.
Right. Wow. So is that often the way it goes? I mean, do you know, I think I'm at the start of a collection when you write a particular poem, or does it often?
Yeah, not always, no. I have in a few instances. I know when I wrote The Zoo Father, that came after a long period of a block, after my father contacted me after 35 years, vanishing. And I had a total block when I went to visit him. I couldn't write about the reality of it. And then one day I went to the little zoo in the Jardin des Plantes, and I wrote a poem called The Zoo Father, which never lasted. There never is a poem in the book called The Zoo Father.
Interesting.
But actually in each stanza, there was a portrait of him or myself as one of the animals in, and they happened to have Amazonian animals in the zoo.
Yeah.
So that's what started it. And then I knew, this is the way to go. And this is how I can write about him, because writing about the mundanity of his room didn't work for me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting, that the kind of how the images that come out, how you find a way to speak about something, because you use such rich imagery in your poetry, and place is just such a huge part of it. And so, yeah, it feels to me as though you're finding the voices to talk about the personal issues or the political issues through, rather than kind of going directly there.
Yeah. So it's like filters, which change what was actual, and make it not just bearable to write about, but enjoyable, pleasurable to write about, because I'm writing about things that I love. Forests, tigers, jaguars, and so on.
Gosh, that's so interesting. I'm kind of almost imagining a meeting point between the therapeutic process of writing, perhaps, that the personal that needs processing or is asking to kind of have a bit of creative attention, but then also that passion and joy of writing, the going to the places you love and just melding the two together. Does that feel about right?
Yeah. I think it's quite complicated.
Yes.
Process. In a way, when something astounding happens to me, like my father appearing, or my need to change my very bad relationship with my mother, and create a book where I love her, almost the kind of intensity of the primary relationship, if you like, gives me a way of writing about the natural world in a very passionate way, which is possibly what I'm actually after.
Oh, interesting. So, yeah, actually, there's a really strong urge from you to portray something about the natural world, to portray some message that you hear from it.
Yes.
And I know you're keep going.
I was just going to say that really kind of started quite a long time ago, in 1990, I think, when the first time I went to Scotland and climbed a little mountain on the west coast, northwest coast, and I had an incredibly strong feeling that the mountain was alive and was watching. And I think it all really came from there. And I suppose around that time, the Gaia hypothesis happened, James Lovelock's hypothesis, which then became a theory that the Earth is a living organism. And it just really something that it became an urgent thing for me to write about somehow.
Yeah. Wow. Something, it's, and that's followed you through all this time. You never get bored.
Yes. No, you can't get bored with the natural world. I mean, it's just full of awe and wonder, really. And it's more how to speak about it in a fresh way, really, and
which you do
describe,
so well. I'm absolutely amazed, honestly. I mean, trying to remember which of your poems it was. I think it was The Green Bee Eater, but also the poem you wrote about Bodmin Moor for AONB, that I just thought, how have you come up with unique ways to talk about things that are actually, particularly that Bodmin poem, we've talked about the Bodmin Bee, so many people have written about it, and you found all these unique ways to approach it. Yeah. And I just wondered, how do you keep that fresh?
Well, when I first moved here, I was interested in going for walks in the forests and by the rivers. And I found the moor rather bleak and windy and cold. So I wasn't that interested in the moor at first. And then I think COVID happened and I couldn't travel. I couldn't go. In any case, travel became a dubious exercise. But I couldn't go to India and look for leopards. So I did start then investigating our very local tor, which is Kilmar Tor, which is a really beautiful. As someone said to me, it's like the back of a dragon or something, the spine of a dragon. And so I regularly would go up there. And so eventually I was doing research and finding out more and more about the beast of Bodmin. And I was, and I wanted this beast to exist, but there'd keep being articles in newspapers from the past about it being a fake, or but an awful lot of farmers and people say actually that it did exist. So then I started writing The Beast of Bodmin, and then I was commissioned, and it's quite good to be commissioned to write something because it kind of makes you.
Yes.
It gives you the subject, so I do like that.
Yeah.
And then I kept going to different parts of the moor as well, and so the poem grew. And it seems that every time I go, I see something new. There's the incredible bog that's between Beera Tor and Kilmar Tor, with its drosseras, sundews, and orchids.
Oh gosh!
And lots of wonderful plants. And then there's a water hole, which is very hard to see from any distance. You have to be right up to it. And the way the horses came to that, or one day a big black bull kind of growled and pawed the ground while his cows, his harem, bathed.
Wow!
And so I wrote about that as well.
So it's striking me like the new environments bring the new language to you. It's almost like they have their own unique stories. So that freshness, you just see it there. Your eyes are open to it.
It's partly the newness. And also I've noticed that I always have to go to a place, like I've been to the Venezuelan Amazon twice.
Right.
I've been to Angel Falls twice. Oh. I climbed Mount Roraima once. I will never do it again. It was really hard for me.
Well done.
And I've been to the Peruvian Amazon twice, and I've been to India twice to look for tigers. So I like an immersion. I like the depth and the opening out and discovering more. So I quite like repeating myself, in fact, but doing it in a different way.
Yeah, I can really relate to that, actually. For me, and I'm curious if it is the same for you, the travel has always been quite a big instigator of my creative writing. And there have been times when I haven't been able to travel, like you mentioned with COVID, for example, where it's felt a little bit like, oh, gosh, actually, I didn't realise quite how much I took this as the place that I write, the way that I write, what I write from. But there is something to the repetition as well, to the immersion, not just seeing something pass, but actually going to a new place, getting that fresh view, and then staying there and embedding for a little bit and letting it kind of drop deeper into our psyche. And
and just it's like going into the roots and almost kind of opening yourself up, learning new ways of looking, really, and of absorbing what's, the strange thing that it is that's surrounding us, this planet,
Yes. I like that word strange, and I'm wondering if the kind of draw to nature is the strangeness, because you were saying before we started talking on the podcast about how you'd lived in London for decades but never written about London. And I know for me, I'm mostly a nature writer as well, and I found it interesting how much I tend to draw to, if I'm writing about people, it's often through nature rather than writing about a cityscape or civilization. And it's not that I'm not interested in people, but I wonder if it's something about the strangeness of the natural world that allows for the writing to come through in a different way to the familiarity of people.
Yeah, I do think, it's the planet is strange. I don't know what it is. I don't think any of us really know what it is. And so it's kind of a life's work to kind of try to make little inroads into it and wonder and think, what is this? And why, why are there tigers? I mean, I know the simple answer is, a food chain that they eat the deer and the wild boar and all that, but it isn't the whole answer. Why are they so beautiful, as well as dangerous?
Wow. Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's great to just bring that curiosity to everything that, I was going to say childlike, but I don't mean that in a patronizing way, just that freshness again, that ability to just look at things and go, hang on a second, why? Look at the wonder here. And you really capture, all of your poetry captures this sense of wonder. And then the fact that you bring in these human themes, I think helps bring a kind of wonder to the wildness in ourselves as well, which
because in a way we're reflecting what's there.
Yeah.
Maybe we're a mirror for it. I don't know. Or maybe it's a mirror for us. Who knows? But yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, I know you're doing I think you're leading a course for the Dark Mountain Project this year, is that?
Oh, yes. Oh, I'm not leading the course. I'm a guest reader.
You're a guest
yes,
reader.
I'm the guest
Have you
reader.
Worked with them before? Is that because they're
I've done a reading and talk with Tom before.
Right.
Yes. But I haven't actually worked with them before.
So, and how is it? Because they are so much about pooling writers that have this interest in the part that creative writing can play in the current environmental situation that we sit within. And how does it feel to be joining in with that?
Well, it's lovely to be invited and to be with Jay as well. And they're both wonderful writers. And it just seems to me that a lot of people don't realise just how precarious our situation is and the planet's situation. So it's really good that there's this course and that the three of us can kind of chat to people about it.
Is that a hope that you have sometimes through your work, that you might draw attention to this precarious situation? Yeah.
Yes, it is, yes. For example, in Mama Amazonica, I put my very mentally ill mother and abused mother in the Amazon rainforest, which also is raped and abused.
Yes.
And the two together, for me, make show just how precarious the forest is, and the fact that if you look at a clay lick where the macaws come to the clay lick, and you can see where the roots are off the trees above it, because they've eaten all the cliffs away, and it's so thin. It's a tiny, thin felt, and those are our lungs, some of our lungs on the planet. So just to clash the two things together, and also the woman and the child, so those with less power, I think. And as nature seems to, well, I don't know, maybe nature actually has more power. Who knows what's going to happen?
Who knows? But it was a really just spot on compatibility, melding those two stories together, and they kind of give each other more power to tell their story by being integrated. And you mentioned earlier about, well, I don't think you used the word, but I'm using the word healing almost, of your relationship with your mum through writing that collection and rewriting this story to have some compassion there. And I wonder if in any sense it gave you some sense of healing of the natural world, of this place that you feel so deeply that destruction of too.
Yes, because it gives the natural world human feelings.
Yeah.
And the fact is that I don't really know what a tree is. I don't really know. I can't get into the head of an animal. So it's just one way of doing it, really.
Gosh, yeah. It's interesting. Yeah.
I was just going to say that earlier you said about childlike.
Yeah.
Because I'm. It may be that my love of the planet, if you like, comes from living with my grandmother and this was in Wales.
Yeah.
This is my Indian grandmother, but she lived in Wales, and she brought me up for most of my childhood. And she had what was to me a very large garden. I'm sure it wasn't that large now, but it seemed to be.
Yeah.
And it was quite a primitive council house with no plumbing or anything like that. And almost everything we ate came from the garden.
Oh, wow.
And I look back on it and I think that the lawn was my savanna.
Yeah.
And the shrubbery was my forest.
Gosh, yeah.
And because I'd gone there from Paris, where I was very unhappy before I was 7, so I think it was the contrast to absolute. Here was a place with loads of animals, and I think I really fell in love with animals there with my grandmother.
That's amazing.
So it is a kind of childlike thing that I've probably kept.
Gosh, that's so
perhaps.
How interesting that recollection of how this has formed up this the two places have met, your childhood and nature, and how they then are playing out intertwined a bit. And what a huge change to go from the streets of Paris to Wales and a small garden or a big garden in your memory.
Yes.
And that's Do you remember straight away feeling a safety or love in that natural environment there?
Yes, I do, because in fact I'd been there when I was a baby until I was 2.5. So not long after I was born, I was with my grandmother.
Right.
And then I was taken back to Paris from the age of 2.5 to 7. Yeah. And so it must have been, I didn't remember, but it must have been a return.
Yes.
And the fact that my grandmother said, she had lots of cats, and there was one called Tibby. And I said, why is she called Tibby? She said, you named her because you couldn't say Tabitha when you were a baby.
Oh, that's lovely. So there was, hidden familiarity there too. And I wonder, because You then wrote your most recent collection, Tiger Girl. That is very much going back to the roots of your grandmother, back to India. And was there a familiarity at all when you went over to India on these trips to research, to have a look? Did you feel anything of your grandmother there?
Yes, I did. I really loved it, actually. I loved the people. I loved the forests. I loved everything about... obviously, it was incredibly hot during the summer and so on. But I just loved all the... I had no idea that there were so many birds, incredible amount of birds in those forests in central India and in Rajasthan, in Ranthambore, as well as Bandhavgarh and Kanha national parks.
Oh, wow.
But yes, at the same time, of course, I learned all about tigers and how they almost vanished not very long ago. The Bengal tigers, the other types are like the Amur tiger, are even more endangered.
Gosh.
Even much fewer of those left. I didn't know before I started writing the book because I'd really concentrated on jaguars. I'd had this passion for jaguars for years. And then I turned to tigers because my grandmother used to tell me a story about being left in a tent when she was a baby in the jungle on her own, and how a tiger walked in.
Wow.
And she didn't get eaten. So I'm sure that's what I thought. Oh yes, I can write about her tiger, and I must go and see what tigers are like. And it was really, really fascinating to see how they differed from zoo tigers, for example, how they differed from jaguars. More ferocious than jaguars, definitely.
Oh, gosh.
And
amazing. And I can hear, in you're talking about it, I can hear the thrill almost, or the passion, and that makes me want to write even. So I think of course you came out with so much from that. And then you've got that connection as well through that personal story. And I'm really interested in how it feels to then publish something so personal, because obviously, yes, there are the tigers, there are the animals, there's the fauna, there's the forests, but there's also you and your story and your family's story that gets told through these collections.
That's right. Yes. So I wanted to celebrate my grandmother. I wanted to celebrate the fact that she saved me, and that her warmth and her love kind of, I'm quite sure, stopped me from being total disaster as a human being.
Yeah.
And I loved her. And so I wanted to have that aspect. And also to tell her stories, and which were secrets. I mean, she didn't tell her children, her grandchildren, that she was Indian or half Indian, or the story of her birth,
right.
or and then yes, the story of the fact that when I was 14, I had to go back to my mother, so in South Wales this time, and how awful that was for me. So there was the banishment from Eden, definitely.
Wow.
That happened twice.
Yeah, I wonder as well whether you using that term, like the banishment from Eden, and I noticed that folklore comes up in your work a lot. Is there an interest in old folk traditions or religious imagery as well that helps you to process again?
Yes, because in fact my grandmother had very few books in the house. She wasn't educated as such, but she had a big book of British folklore, in fact, which I've got somewhere. And she had second sight, but it was a very strong second sight. So she was clairvoyant.
Wow.
She knew when someone had just died before she got the news. She would see them. She would see their ghost. And she would tell fortunes at fairs, and she'd dress up as a gypsy, and I would go with her. So I guess there was a natural environment of the supernatural for me, and also a Catholic background that I had as well. So the supernatural and the spiritual were there, and the excitement of that, because it is exciting, It's a bit frightening as well. She did used to say that it was actually frightening to have the second sight.
Yes, gosh, I can only imagine. And it's interesting you're using those words, actually, that joy and that frightening fear as well, because again in your work I get both those worlds. I get both those feelings. Like there's a darkness and an intensity, and there's also like a real brightness and opening. So it's as though you can bring that into your words and weave it into the poems themselves, which is quite a feat.
Thank you.
And you've recently won a few quite big prizes for your work. Has that changed anything for you in terms of how you feel about your writing or moving forwards?
Well, yes, of course, yes. I don't think of myself as a poet with that much self-confidence, So, and sometimes poems are easy to write, but a lot of the time they're very hard. And so, to get the 2 prizes for Mama Amazonico was just amazing, and helps definitely. And so I've been working on my novel.
Oh wow!
And that's I'm on the kind of just on the touches of it, yes.
Right.
But it's a secret at the moment.
Keep quiet, everybody. That's so interesting, because actually something that I wanted to ask you was about your commitment to poetry, because I, as a writer, I dabble in everything. And a few of the writers that have come on the podcast they do a bit of memoir, they do a bit of poetry, they do a bit of novel writing or short stories. And yet your career has so much been these incredible, now 8 collections of poetry. But now you're telling me actually there is another strand that comes in.
Well, yes. There's the novel, which I started writing 17 years ago.
Wow.
And actually 2 of the collections came from it. So, I won't say anything more about that because, until it's further along, it's best not to.
Yeah.
But I did actually start out as a sculptor originally. I went to art school. I have 6 years at art school behind me, and I don't have any literary training, but I did always want to be a poet. And at the beginning, I did write some little novellas, you might say. That obviously didn't work. This was a long time ago. And then I used to write short stories too. And now I can't for the life of me think, how on earth do you write a short story? I don't know.
I feel the same. It's weird. When I was younger, I would just write them, and now, how do you do that?
Now because I think I know that people say, oh, it's so hard to write a short story, and I think, oh no, I can't do that. When I stopped making sculptures, then the poems got better, in fact, because it's not that I dabbled. I was serious. What I would do was I would spend a year as trying to be a poet, and then I'd spend a year very seriously as a sculptor. Okay. Nothing literary at all, I was just a sculptor. And then I'd alternate. It was like 2 different people almost, except the subjects were the same, but different media.
And what would push you to switch again? What would make that change happen?
Well, I know that with poems it would be because I couldn't get better.
Right.
So I would think, never mind, I can make sculptures instead.
Okay.
And yes, sculpture was very hard work for me. I'm really quite weak and very small. So it was, and I was making difficult things too, life-size figures and doing resin casting and stuff. So it's when I came across difficulty in one, then I'd switch. And it was when I stopped making sculptures so that I could no longer evade the difficulty. I had to work through it.
Wow.
With poems.
Yeah.
I think that really helped.
That's
because now I have to work through it really. With writing.
And how did you decide to finally stop with that sculpting process?
Oh, I think I just decided that it was too hard for me physically.
Right.
I went 10 years, there were 10 years in between my two courses, between my BA and then my MA, and I went to the Royal College of Art, which took me a long time to get into.
Yeah.
But I had a hard time there. And there was one tutor who used to say to me how much better my poems were. And I think, in the end, I just decided that it was easier for me to manipulate metaphor and images in words than to actually mess around with materials. And so it's down to that.
No, that's fascinating that for such a long time it was, I'm actually better at the other. I'm better at the sculpting. That seems to be easier. And then that realization of actually, do you know what? I've got into the place where what I actually yearn to get from this process, I'm actually getting or achieving more through the writing. And when I was reading about the fact that you'd been a sculptor, I couldn't help but draw that parallel to sculpting words, to coming up with images and shaping the words and shaping the lines. And it made me think, it kind of makes sense now why your poetry is, that feels a bit big to even say it, but so perfect that there's this kind of careful sculpting of it. No. I won't say it.
But what was I going to say about it? I even though I'd given up sculpture, I mean, I my whole life had revolved around being a sculptor, so it was, I had to do it to survive.
Right.
So then I really tried to put it into the poems so that I made them as solid as I could. Yet, when I was a sculptor, I worked with transparency a lot. So I made figures that were transparent.
Oh, wow.
And I worked with glass. And so, and thorns and all the things that I have in my poems, but lots of birds. So I wanted the poems to be solid but transparent.
Right. So
another thing that I have consciously worked on is accessibility, so that they are accessible as well. And I think if I make them very physical, that helps to make them accessible for other people.
Yeah. What a beautiful way of pulling the qualities from one art form into the other, and therefore achieving more of what you hope for or what you wish to be able to portray. And it's something I do really like about and appreciate about your poems, because actually for me, that's the type of, I need poetry to be accessible for me to find that access into it. I tend to, I think many people get a bit alarmed when I can't tell what's going on and find myself pulling back and feeling like, I don't have a place in this. Whereas yours create a pathway in, and then there's huge complexity to them as well, which means that the depth is still there.
Thank you. Yeah, that's what I aim for, is an easy access, and then depths inside. But it does. bother me that the readership and the audience, well, it's more the readership for poetry, is so niche, and so many people are put off it. And I really love it, for example, when teenagers like my poems, and I think, yes, I've reached through to them.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, and I do hope that there's a bit of a new era of that some, what with spoken word and new artists using music and poetry, that there's a bit more of a sense of accessibility and people maybe not hearing the word and just shying or eking away so quickly. But how did you find it? How did you find poetry then, and not have that fear about starting to try writing it?
Well, when I was at school, I heard the teacher read out Keats' Ode to a Nightingale. And I don't know how old I was, I think about 16. And I was a very withdrawn child, possibly, or teenager, in fact, possibly on the spectrum, I was in a world of my own, and I felt as if someone was speaking to me. And I loved the organic forest quality of the poem, and the depth of the poem. And so from that moment on, I thought, I would love to join in this world and try and create worlds with words. And so that was the introduction to poetry, I think. It was very hard for me to get into it, partly because I was a serious sculptor, so I suppose I wasn't 100%, dedicated to it. And also, having to earn a living and not having much money and all that. But back in the 80s, late 70s, 80s, there were only, say, 2 MAs in creative writing that existed, as far as I know, and I couldn't do those. I'd done an MA in sculpture, and there just wasn't the kind of critical but encouraging workshops that there are now. So there were 1 or 2 that I belonged to. But let's say that I was a very slow learner, and it took me a long time. Plus, I always wanted to write about the wilderness. And in the 80s and probably the 90s, I think the urban was what was in vogue with poetry, if I may say that. And so I felt that I wasn't in fashion at all. I was out of sync with it. So but I did stick with it,
which is amazing, because was it in your 40s that you started becoming established as a poet?
Yes. Well, yes. I published my first collection. I think I was 44 when that happened, or 43. But my first book, Heart of a Deer, didn't get any notice. And then the incredible thing happened with my father. And I wrote The Zoo Father, and that got a lot more notice. And it got shortlisted for the TS Eliot,
which is huge.
A few other things, and so that was a bit of a turning point for me.
Were you in London
at
that point? Was that?
Yes. Yes.
Does that feel important, looking back, that being able to be at the centre of the literary scene when you were starting to put work out?
Yes, it did. It did help to be in London. Although I'm not by nature a very sociable person, but I would go to poetry events and stuff. And at the time too, I was poetry editor of Poetry London for many years. So I was kind of I knew a lot of people, and gradually I kind of learned how to write.
Yes, amazing. And established yourself so well. It's incredible. And how has it been then moving down here? Are you part of a community of writers still? Does that still feel relevant or important?
I have been welcomed very warmly by poets in Cornwall, I must say. I don't drive, and I live out in a very rural location, so I don't actually meet up with people, and I am quite a hermit at heart. So, but I'm on social media, and that's a way of keeping in touch with people.
Yeah.
But yes, everyone's been really good to me, and even in the little hamlet where I live, they kind of heard of me before I moved here, and were really welcoming and lovely.
Oh wow! What a thing to arrive to a legacy already. That's so interesting. I'm curious when you were talking about the poetry collection, the Zoo, and how that suddenly brought everything to the forefront. And you were saying that earlier about how that came off the back of actually a period of block, which so many writers don't talk about. And I know I've experienced that definitely personally, and often in response to when big things are going on personally in my life, and it just almost creating a physical as well as mental block to being able to write about it. And so I'm really interested that you're open about that, and how that was to go through that and how that shifted.
Yeah. And it literally was that day when I was at the little zoo, the menagerie in the Jardin des Plantes. And I was supposed to go to an event in Shakespeare and Company, the bookshop, in the evening. But I came home from the zoo, and I immediately started writing this poem. And I thought, I'm not going to go out, because this is something new, you know. And although the poem didn't last, it was a germ, a proto-poem for all the poems in the collection, really. Right. They're all portraits of my father and myself. And through the animals, I was able to say much more than I consciously knew about what had happened with him.
Yeah. It's amazing. It is funny. It just makes me think that it's about, and again, I've had this experience of waiting for a particular image or moment or ray of light that suddenly meets the subconscious almost, and starts talking and starts creating that pathway again to words and to speaking about things through words.
It's so strange how that happens, because it's how I started Mama Amazonica as well. I was spending time in Paris, and I rented a room there. I don't anymore. And at a month at a time. I mean, it's very expensive.
Right.
And because it was very expensive too, I would really have to write. I couldn't do anything else.
Yeah.
And I brought with me a big notebook from Kew Gardens with leaves on the cover. And in it, I had a picture of the Victoria Amazonica lily. And so 20 years ago, I had tried to write a poem about it and failed. And I thought, I wonder if I should have another go and write about. And then I started writing about my mother. It just came into my head to do that. And that's how the book was born, kind of thing.
Yeah. So magical how these things are birthed. Do you ever make visual art still? Is that ever a kind of, actually, hang on, I have the urge to tell it through this? Or did that literally just move straight into writing? And well, we know it's not straight into, but...
Yeah, no. At the time, I was doing a lot of residencies in schools. I was doing residencies around the Gaia hypothesis, as it was then. And so I was helping kids to make art and in fact, to dress up as the world's environments and stuff like that. And so there was a transition when I just gradually stopped. So no, I don't. But I think if I was wealthier and I had more space, I might make little things, I might. And I had a little bit more time.
Yeah.
I wouldn't make big things anymore. I would make small things. And so yes, there is that other world that I think, what if?
Yeah, interesting.
But I still collect things, though. I still collect things as when I was a sculptor, natural objects like nests and stuff, nests and skulls.
And are those kind of prompts to you for writing? Because I know, for instance, your poem Prize photograph started from a photograph. And do you find, when you collect something that's a little prompt that you can then use?
Yeah. So, sometimes there are other people's, a lot of artworks that prompt me as well, like a lot of paintings, because I was never a painter.
Yes.
And I wrote a whole book about in the voice of Frida Kahlo.
Yes, I was going to
say. Because when I was at the Royal College, actually, a tutor said to me that the way I'd laid out my studio, he said, really reminded him of the Blue House, Frida Kahlo's Blue House.
Interesting.
And so that remark stayed in my head, and then I didn't actually know her work then, but then I got to know it, and then eventually I went to Mexico a few times and walked around the Blue House and the other houses where she lived. And and then wrote that book, which was like a bit of a holiday from the other books in a way, because in the other books I'm usually a child, but in the Frida Kahlo book I'm an adult, I'm a young woman.
Yes, and that inhabiting her world so much, and yet her not being someone that was necessarily familiar to you. But then there is that real connection through the artwork and through your arts background, and obviously a bit of a calling there.
Yes, and there was the coincidence of hummingbirds and thorn necklaces and all the things that I'd used.
Wow.
And but also it was when I read her diary, and it was introduced by Carlos Fuentes, who said that the bus, when she had that terrible accident when she was a teenager, and the tram that she was in collided with a bus, and a rail went through her vagina, in fact. And she was so wounded from it all. He said she was raped by a bus. And I thought, oh, wow, maybe I can write about rape with there being no one to blame. So it's not about blaming someone. It's just about how you survive by making art, and the wonderful ways that she survived, making herself beautiful and making these incredible little votive paintings.
Oh, that's such an amazing perspective at it. Yeah. Gosh.
Surrounding herself with animals as well.
How do you then, what's your process? So these ideas, we've heard a lot about how they come to you and the ways in that you then take, but then how do they start forming into words on a page, and how do you then reshape them into poems? Do you have a process, or is it always different?
I think it's always different. There are poems that I've written almost straight off when I've seen an image, for example, or a phrase. For example, the green bee eater came from the phrase that I saw that an ornithologist said that it sings tree, tree, tree. And I immediately then wrote the poem, because I thought, oh my goodness, this bird says tree. And in the Zoo Father, and also in Mama Amazonica and elsewhere, which will come to light, there is the image of the hummingbirds in the suitcase, the Straitjackets poem, which started with a straitjacket. And that poem was written straight off from seeing the photograph of 40 hummingbirds wrapped up in a suitcase. So it can be really different. There's sometimes poems are very long, have a very long process. For example, The Jaguar, which is the last poem in Mama Amazonica, I started I knew it was going to be the last poem, so and I'd seen a jaguar in the wild, and I hadn't written about it yet in the book, so I really wanted to do that. And I thought, how on earth am I going to do that? And so I started by trying to write a cento, which is a poem where you collage together lines from other poets that you admire.
Wow.
And then I came across to do that, you have to, of course, look up all your favourite lines and poets. And I was looking up references to jaguars, and there was Pablo Neruda's Like a River of Buried Jaguars, which comes in his Heights of Machu Picchu. And so while I was trying to write this cento, which came to nothing, that line stuck. And that became the epigraph to my poem, The Jaguar.
Yeah.
So that was how I did it.
I'm just
thinking... So it can be by collecting words.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, literally what I was about to say, you've just proven it even more. I was going to say, you're really going to have to come and see the new writer's block when we set it up, because so much of what you've just talked about is so attuned to the processes we do. And actually we often have jars of words as one of the prompts that are used in the workshops, this thing of collecting words and then pulling them out and seeing what comes from that, and using images and using collage. And so, it's really interesting hearing how you also use these aspects as creative ways in, which,
yes.
It's amazing.
So with that poem, Prize Photograph, which was about that terrible incident of the elephant calf that got set on fire as it was crossing the road. I came across that on Instagram because once I'd left India, then I continued following a lot of the photographers that work with those tigers and elephants in Madhya Pradesh.
Yeah.
And so I came across it there and then wrote a poem based on it. And because I really, really wanted to write about how, yes, the local farmers set it on fire by throwing firecrackers at it. They didn't mean to set it on fire. They needed the elephants to go away because they're ruining their crop, and they are so poor that they've got to eat. And I wanted to try and say that without preaching, that it's a very complex business of conserving animals and forest, as well as people trying to stay alive.
Yeah.
So
it's finding the story beneath the story even and putting that across.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you so much for everything you've shared with us. It's been a wonderful conversation to have. And before I let you go, I wonder if I ask every guest this, what would be your perfect writing day? If I could gift you the perfect writing day right now, what would it involve?
It involves me sleeping really well, being able to wake up really early, having a cup of tea in bed and starting to write then. Maybe casting around, looking at poems that aren't working or notebooks, and trying to write just with that freshness of having just woken up before the day takes over. But before the messiness of the day and the outwardness of the day, the terrible things happening that bring you down as well. So it would be that, and then having breakfast, and then going for a walk, and standing at I have a standing desk gate, I call it, halfway along my walk, and then I look at my poem there, or else I just look at the woods around the river and see if I can see anything.
Gosh.
Looking up at the trees again and thinking, what are you, and trying to photograph them, but iPhones just cannot capture that depth of field of them. So yeah, it would be that. And then I yes, that would be the writing part of the day, and then I'd have another session in the early evening before dinner.
Amazing. And I love that question. What are you? I'm gonna ask many things that now, and hope to glean some inspiration from it. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for your time, and thanks for sharing everything about your work. And it's been an absolute pleasure to get to talk to you. And hopefully we'll get you involved.
Thank you so much for asking me, Polly. Thank you.
Thanks.
And for your wonderful questions.
Oh,
bye.
So welcome. Next episode, I'll be speaking with Misri Day, an international theatre practitioner. Misri is Senior Lecturer at Falmouth University in Theatre and Acting. Her latest solo show, Family Tree, explored themes of identity, melding the personal and the political. We look forward to welcoming you back to listen. Click subscribe to hear when this episode is released and to help us share these conversations with others. You've been listening to the Writer's Block podcast. Find out more about the Writer's Block at thewritersblock.org.uk. Music and sound was by Jimmy Marshall from southwestsonic.com. Thank you for listening.